Good morning, everyone. What a great topic we have today. Welcome. I can't tell you how appreciative we are, not only to our sponsors, but above all, to those of you who will be speaking today. Indeed, today's topic, African photography, the ethics of looking in an age of restitution, is so urgent that we at the Italian Academy and our International Observatory for Cultural Heritage are honored not only by the presence of our speakers from far and wide, but also by that of all of you who will be here today to ponder so complex and so central a subject. Today's conference follows a series of enormously productive conferences brought to us by my dear colleague Zoe Strother on African art, image making, and image destruction, which we at the Italian Academy and the International Observatory for Cultural Heritage have been proud to present. And we really look forward to the next one, in which we hope we will be able to host you personally so that the interpersonal conversations can be face-to-face and go on for much longer than these Zooming events usually allow. But I've no doubt they'll continue anyway in the halls and passageways of your own institutions. Now, it's true the questions raised by that basically hitherto little recognized subject of what Ariella Azoulay, you remember, called the civil contract of photography, have only multiplied in the age of digitization, multimediality, VR, and AI. And so the rights to privacy and opacity, the monetization of images of enslaved and colonized peoples of all kinds, the acknowledgement of the full implications of the relationship between embodiment and image display, all these are issues which have been habitually ignored and continue to be so, certainly in the wider art world, to say nothing of the completely commercialized art world now. Indeed, the objectification and monetization of embodied persons is not just a matter of the representation of exotic individuality, as arguably it already was in the case, say, of Rembrandt, whose works on the market certainly monetized individuality. So that's not new, but it's the objectification, the monetization and wanton taking possession of persons themselves. I'd like to think that we're indeed living in an age of restitution, but as I'm sure you all agree, we're not quite there yet, to say the least. I wanted to say something this morning about the implications for VR, because obviously VR gives much more opportunity for manipulation of the embodied figure. And I had long arguments with the group we had here at the Italian Academy this past semester about the distinctions, their insistence on the distinctions between VR and ordinary image making. But the central problem is that the image remains embodied. And what do we do with the bodies in the image? I'm intent on applying the lessons we learned today to all aspects of image making, including virtual reality. Could talk for this to talk about this topic at great length, but I leave that for the next time I'm invited to actually give a talk. But I want to end, because we only have a short day for a long succession of discussions, which I'm sure will be fruitful. I'm just going to end, if I be allowed, on a personal note. I hope you won't think that I'm being too sentimental, but somehow this event today touches a very personal chord. In a profound way, it comes very close to the end of my Columbia career and represents one of the best kinds of homecoming, fraught as the very notion of home might be, and at least triply fraught as it is in my own case. For not only am I moved by the presence of a whole number of my Columbia colleagues and students, past and present at this important event, like Zoe, like John Peffer, like Giulia Paoletti, but also by people, I had warned them, I would say this, by people like Patricia Hayes and Ingrid Masondo, whose presence takes me back not just to the place of my birth and upbringing in South Africa, first on the sandy wastes between Parow and Tiervlei, so close to Ingrid's University of the Western Cape, which did not exist then, and then rather closer to the site of Iziko, the South African National Gallery. That's when my parents moved up in the world and we were taken from Tiervlei to Claremont, those of you who know those particular areas. That was all before I was thrown out in 1966. Any rate, but it also reminds me of the trips my parents used to take us children to KwaZulu, when my father, perhaps because of some sense of the civil contract between peoples, forbade us from taking the photographs we wanted to in the Zulu villages we visited, ever aware of the invasive scopophilia of the few tourists there in those days. The earliest sense I had of the civil rights of photography and the fact that these photographs were bound up with the civil and ethical rights and expectations of the other, which in turn prepared me later for my long struggle with the same questions as posed by, or the similar questions as posed by, the cultural interactions, constraints, and difficulties of joint looking when I spent so much time in the Pueblo villages in the 1980s and 1990s of the American Southwest. These are struggles that must continue, and I'm more moved than I can say by having been asked to welcome you all here today. A really great welcome from the heart to all of you today. May you have great discussions, and onwards now with our discussions and our debates and our deliberations on these important issues. Thank you so much for being with us.
Good morning, everyone. I am Douglas Fordham, the chair of the art department at the University of Virginia, and I'm delighted for UVA to be one of the university hosts for this conference, along with Columbia. Colonial legacies at UVA are long and unmistakable. Rising from the unceded lands of the Monacan Nation, the wilderness outpost of Charlottesville, Virginia, was named after Britain's Queen Charlotte in 1762. Half a century later, President Thomas Jefferson founded a public university a few miles from his home at Monticello, and these two architectural complexes were built with enslaved labor from those of African descent. For most of UVA's history, those legacies went entirely unacknowledged, and the histories, languages, and cultures of Africa went largely unconsidered and untaught. I'm pleased to report that today one can find sustained and wide-ranging interest in the histories and cultures of Africa here at UVA. And this can be seen in the many funding partners who have contributed to this conference. And that's my main role, is to simply acknowledge so many of our supporting institutions here at UVA. The Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies, which was founded in 1981, has played a foundational role in the promotion of African and diasporic studies at UVA, and we're very grateful for their support. More recently, the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures, which has been led by Debjani Ganguly, has become an intellectual town square for faculty and students across the university to challenge a great many shibboleths of academic specialization and to reconsider African cultures and their current place in the world. I'm also pleased to acknowledge the support of the Buckner W. Clay Endowment for the Humanities, UVA Arts, and the Office of the Provost and Vice Provost of the Arts. And finally, the art department and the PhD program in art and architectural history are very proud to support this conference, and I want to thank the graduate students in particular who helped to organize this event. Just as a side note, our department has pioneered an Indigenous Studies interdisciplinary PhD program, which is in conjunction with the departments of Anthropology and Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian, which considers indigeneity in a global perspective. And I think it's one of these truly interdisciplinary types of projects that this conference embodies, and that we need to wrestle with the kind of problems that are on the table, such as those that David just acknowledged. In our first two cohorts of the Indigenous Studies PhD program, we've welcomed 2 Nigerian PhD students, and it's been interesting to see the extent to which the place of Western and Southern Africa has emerged as a topic of discussion in this burgeoning field of Indigenous studies. And finally, I would just to conclude by saying that the art department has benefited tremendously from the addition of Assistant Professor Julia Paoletti to our faculty, and it is to her that we owe so much of today's event. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm very much looking forward to the day.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Zoe Strother. I'm one of the organizers. And it looks so simple to organize a webinar, but oh my gosh, it takes a rather large village. First of all, we thank David Freedberg and Barbara Fida at the Italian Academy, who believed in the project from the beginning. It would not have happened without them, and their marvelous team, Abigail Asher, Kathleen Cagnina, Irvis Dinkel. I thank my co-organizer, Julia Paoletti at UVA, who provided the intellectual credibility for the symposium. In all honesty, pretty much everything good in it can be attributed to Julia, including the brilliant addition of Ash Durkoop and Eleonora Neumann to our team. Critical funds were provided by the Departments of Art History and Archaeology and African American and African Diaspora Studies. And we also give a shout out to Monica Bravo at the Photography Network for funds, but also for serving as our interlocutor. The Mellon Foundation was also an important contributor. And most of all, we thank our speakers for sharing their invaluable perspectives with us. So what is the conference about? As of 2022, it is well documented that Africans were photographing themselves for their own pleasure in some parts of Africa, beginning in the 19th century. As of 2022, it is well documented that many European travelers and imperialists sought out photographs from African photographers to populate their own photo albums. For example, Alfonso Lascaru, who sold cityscapes and ethnographic records, as well as portraits in Sierra Leone, proud to advertise his patronage by Queen Victoria's son, the Duke of Connaught. Nonetheless, outside of Africa, cultural and photographic theorists were blind to this production. No less a figure than Susan Sontag mused repeatedly on the fantasy that, quote, as everyone knows, Africans rejected the camera for fear of losing parts of themselves. All of that ended in 1991-92, when studio portraits by Malian Seydou Keïta were exhibited almost simultaneously in Paris and New York. In a flash, the claim that Africans did not take photographs was discredited, and a powerful body of work representing Africans as they wished to see themselves came into focus. It is jaw-dropping that within 4 years, French photographer Françoise Huguier succeeded in promoting Keïta to be published alongside Brassai and Walker Evans as the only artist of color in the cult pocket photo collection published by the French National Center for Photography. Within 7 years, not only Keïta, but African photography more broadly became a staple in international pop culture. Especially notable was Janet Jackson's Grammy-winning music video for Got It Till It's Gone, composed by Mark Romanek in 1997, with stylized quotations from Keïta, Samuel Fosso, Malik Sidibe, Drum Magazine, and other sources. I even play a game show with my students, asking them to shout out the name of who's being quoted. It's Samuel Fosso with his self-portrait from 1977. Janet Jackson herself grips a box radio and an alarm clock, as in two famous Keïta photos. The video makes palpable the desire of audiences in Europe and the US in the 1990s to enter these photos, to inhabit them, to borrow a useful phrase from Lebohang Kyangye. Now, ethical issues were raised almost immediately. Elizabeth Bingham in 1999 argued forcefully that we should consider the so-called subjects of the photos creative co-authors who sought out Keïta and who conceived how the self should be represented. She also questioned whether André Magnin and collector Jean Pigozzi, who quickly gained control over the reprinting of the photos, were not reauthoring Seydou Keïta, as has Candace Keller. For example, the gentle tonal contrast of the vintage print on the left captures the radiance of the woman's skin and enhances her presence, whereas the photos made in Europe are high contrast and diminish the impact of the rounding of the form. They privilege the pattern over that sense of the embodied sitter. Other ethical issues have emerged. How much do we need to know about the historical context or local concepts of photography? In 1998, Mantia Diawara made a dazzling intervention, revealing just how much cultural knowledge enhances our appreciation of the images. He argued that Keïta's sitters came to him to be reassured that they could pass as sophisticated urbanites. And Diawara took the unusual strategy of analyzing what he regarded as Seydou Keïta's failures. For example, he interprets this image as showing two young women who have come to the city and purchased fashionable head ties and dresses and handbags with the hope of passing as Bamakoises. However, Keïta betrays them by posing them to show off their well-toned arms, which identify them unmistakably as farmers. Today, you'll find that most of our speakers are concerned to some degree with the issue of how to respond to the erasure of names, oral history, and other forms of local knowledge from the image. Among the Maori and Native Americans, among whom restitution initiatives are more advanced, the drive to reunite local knowledge with the objects under concern often emerges as the most important issue. Now, South African photographer Santu Mofokeng was one of the first to raise the issue of family portraits. Famously, after working as documentary photographer exposing the abuses of the apartheid system in South Africa, he was caught off guard when a Black visitor to an exhibition in the township accused him of, quote, making money off of Blacks in the guest book. He began to ask what photos Black South Africans treasured and discovered a cornucopia of family photos. In some cases, important aspects of social history were recovered, as here in the connection of the sitter with Marcus Garvey, but in many other cases, not much was remembered apart from the name. The tension between transparency and the right to opacity, particularly in regards to family photos, has emerged as a major theme in this conference. Artist Lebohang Kyange addresses precisely issues of memory loss and the staging of family memories. John Peffer will explore how copyright and other legal strategies can fail subjects who wish to assert their right to opacity. He asks, do we need to illustrate everything, even if we have the legal right to do so? Sandrine Collard will address the collision of the private and the scholarly in her own autobiographical reflections. Julia Paoletti will demonstrate that restoring the names to so-called subjects can reveal the network of relationships through which photographs circulate and gain interpretability. Now, Keïta's commercial success prompted dealers to scour the continent looking for other talents, resulting in a troubling transfer of photo archives off the continent, a situation flagged in 2014 by Candace Keller. The materiality of photographs as daguerreotypes, glass plates, negatives, and vintage prints raise pressing issues of ownership, an issue at the center of restitution initiatives. In the roundtable, Ingrid Masondo and Candace Keller will address some of the ethics and challenges of collecting photographs on the continent as perceived in Mali and South Africa. Now, although the symposium is centered on Africa, we realize that these issues have wide reach today. Many of you will have followed the lawsuit by Tamara Lanier against Harvard University, petitioning for the return of precious daguerreotypes of her ancestors, Renty Taylor and his daughter Delia, photographed in 1850 in South Carolina. These images are deemed to be the earliest photographs of enslaved individuals in the United States. Lanier lost her lawsuit, and this reflects the frustration experienced across the restitution community including, for example, those concerned with Nazi looting, their frustration to develop alternative moral paradigms. Indeed, a former compliance officer at Sotheby's told me that she did not think the issues could be solved through legal means, preferring to see codes of best practices developed by leading institutions. Also, in initiatives concerned with restitution, there is sometimes hope expressed that digitization will offer a means out of the dilemmas posed by the regimes of property law. And this is especially true when dealing with the reproducible medium of photography. Just this week, Digital Benin was launched, and we were fortunate to have Osai Sonor Godfrey Ekhator Obogie with us today to give an Edo perspective on this initiative. But the need to think about digitization deeply is why our conference will close with a keynote by Temi Odumosu, who has been wrestling with the ethics of circulating digital files, the colonial structure of metadata, and documentation. As you will hear, she proposes to develop anti-colonial methods of record keeping. As Jane Anderson and Kimberly Kristen write in the context of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, quote, "The issue for Indigenous peoples is not only finding and accessing their cultural content, but also being able to undo and reframe the materials within the metadata first, and then adding community perspectives that can affect how decisions about its use, reuse, and circulation can be made." So I thank Sabrina Mora for bringing Sasha Uber's series, Tailoring for Freedom, to my attention. Like John Peffer, Uber asked, what do we really need to see? Instead of reproducing Renty and Delia Taylor topless, she clothes them in fashions of 19th century abolitionists, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Instead of replaying degradation, she wraps them in a cocoon of love and respect, notably asking permission from Tamara Lanier, even when she was not legally bound to do so. She challenges us to find new ways of looking at photos. And I close with the reflection of our concluding speaker, Stephen Nelson. To decolonize means recreating the world, and to summon Audre Lorde, seeking new ways of being in it.